Boxie. Boxie. Hi there, everybody. It's Larry Harnisch and Boxie with the Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel for December 2024. If you are new, um, I started doing the Ask Me Anythings a while back because um, I got tired of the true crime industrial complex. I just got sick of it. I don't do interviews anymore. I did one for the LA Times. I had to be talked into it. Um, I told them I don't want you to use my voice, and they said, "Well," and then I finally said, "Okay, you can use me in the podcast." But that's it. Anyway, this is the final Ask Me Anything of the year. I This will be strictly George Hodel and Steve Hodel. I do another one the first Tuesday of the month on the Black Dahlia case. The next one will be in January 2025. And let me point out, we are heading into the beginning of Black Dahlia season. January is, of course, the anniversary of Elizabeth Short's murder. And that's typically a time for anniversary stories. I should know, I wrote one. Um, so that is the beginning of the Black Dahlia season. And so you should expect to see more Black Dahlia anniversary stories, probably that will deal with George Hodel. But again, I got so many George Hodel and Steve Hodel questions that I split them off into another one. So this is only George Hodel and Steve Hodel questions. Anything beyond that about the Black Dahlia case, no. So that's kind of where we are. Um, I have been tinkering. I get a lot of harassment. I get a lot of trolls and whatnot. I'm tinkering with the settings. Um, I had I had a service called Nightbot that I had set pretty aggressively. I kind of dialed that back a little bit. Um, if I get a lot of trolls and harassment, I'll have to turn it back up. Anyway, um, who am I, and why am I fact checking Steve Hodel? Well, I started fact checking Steve since publication of Black Dahlia Avenger in 2003. I had been researching the Black Dahlia case since 1996, and I wrote this anniversary story that I was talking about. Um, I was asked to fact check this book very quickly for a Los Angeles Times columnist. That's how I got this copy, and it's just bonkers crazy. I mean, that is the short answer. So anyway, but it seemed appropriate for new people. I've gotten some new people kind of questions. So the way this works is I talk for a while, and then I open it up for questions. And I have a couple of submitted questions, one of which I want to deal with kind of at the outset. And if you have heard this before, this is kind of for the new people. So just kind of listen along. Um, but I want to say at the very beginning, I have been fact checking Steve Hodel since 2003, and the average person who doesn't know anything about the history of Los Angeles, doesn't know anything about the history of the LAPD, doesn't know how law enforcement works really, doesn't know how the court system works, how the legal system works, how grand juries operate, the rules of evidence. If you don't know anything about the art world or the medical profession, you cannot believe, you cannot imagine how much Steve Hodel has made up over the years. And, you know, this is 21 years ago. Steve has spent 21 years, it's his life's work to create this increasingly elaborate, wild scenario about his dad. Um, it really is stunning just how much Steve has made it. It's kind of like the Winchester House of conspiracy theories, where Steve will come along and he'll build a new stairway somewhere, or he'll put a new window someplace else. I mean, it's never ending. It's hard to keep up with. So, but what I want to say is this: mostly, I would say 95% of what people think they know about George Hodel is what Steve says. Okay. Very few people want to do the original pick and shovel work to research independently the life of George Hodel. I'm one of them, but it's very few. Mostly what people know about George Hodel comes directly from Steve and his whole series of books, or sources that have repackaged what Steve says, newspaper articles, magazine articles, Wikipedia. Everything goes back to one place, and that's Steve Hodel. So, and the genesis for this question is, how was George Hodel dragged into the Black Dahlia case? That is a short question with a very long answer. So what I'm going to talk about this time very briefly, and again, if you have heard some of this or most of this, I apologize. There's always some new folks. But I'm going to kind of do a recap of the life of George Hodel. Just a thumbnail, because the guy had a complicated life, even without Steve's claims. Just as kind of a counterpoint to what you think you know about him, because it's really very different. George Hodel is born here in Los Angeles, and his parents, he's an only child. His parents are fairly well-to-do. His dad is a financier and investor. I think he does insurance. I think he does real estate. That will be important later. George Hodel Sr., investment in real estate. So they have this son, George Jr., George Hill Hodel Jr. Now, to keep them from getting mixed up, a lot of time in George Hodel's life, he referred to himself as G. Hill Hodel. He didn't call himself George Jr. or even go by George. In case you want to independently research the life of George Hodel, and I recommend you do that. Go through the old papers. Anyway, he's born in 1907, and he's kind of it's a rich family. He's kind of pampered. He's kind of indulged. He's a smart kid. He gets involved in the Lewis Terman project, and Lewis Terman is the guy who put Stanford in Stanford-Binet. George Hodel's IQ is not as high as Steve Hodel says, but it's a respectable score. Whatever weight you put on IQ tests, and I'm not I tested high on IQ tests, and I'm not a big fan of them. So yeah. And anyway, he plays the piano. He goes to high school here in South Pasadena, and he graduates from South Pasadena at a pretty early age. I think 15, something like that. Which again, I graduated from high school at 16, so it's like, big deal. I'm not impressed by that. I did it. Anyway, George goes to Caltech, which is the local, California Institute for Technology. It's the local version of MIT. And he goes there for a year under, I think, general education. I don't think he didn't plan to be an engineer or something like that. But anyway, he goes to Caltech for about a year, and then he goes off the grid. And the next we hear from him, he's married. He marries a woman, and Steve will put up, they weren't really married. It was a common law. No, common law marriage isn't recognized in California. You can't do that. It was a common law. No, they were married. It was a woman named, she shows up as Emilia. Anyway, they get married, and they go up to the Bay Area, and George finishes his bachelor's degree at Berkeley, and he graduates in, let me go back here and see, when does he graduate from Berkeley? I've got to get into my notes here. Graduates from Berkeley in 1932, and then goes into medical school. And so he goes through medical school. At this point, he's got a son with Emilia. That's Duncan. Duncan will be important. And I should point out, George Hodel has a lot of wives. George Hodel has a lot of kids. Okay. Not all of them are important. I'm only going to mention three of the girlfriends / wives and some of the kids. The wives that you need to remember are Emilia, Dorothy number 1, who has a daughter, Tamar, and Dorothy number 2, who has 3 boys, including Steve Hodel. Okay, those are all the women you need to remember. And then the kids you need to remember are Duncan, son from wife number 1, Tamar from Dorothy number 1, and the 3 boys from Dorothy number 2. Michael, will become a radio announcer on KPFK. Steve, who becomes a homicide detective with the LAPD, and Kelvin. And Kelvin is really irrelevant. So anyway, George finesses Emilia at this point, and Duncan, and he has a daughter, apparently, with Dorothy number 1. Now, when you go to Tamar's birth certificate, and Tamar is really the devil child of all of the Hodel family. We'll have a lot more to say about her. Anyway, when you go to Tamar's birth certificate, there's no father listed. Apparently, George was the dad based on his behavior, but there is no father listed on her birth certificate. Anyway, that's Tamar, and so George finishes medical school. He does his internship, and he does postgraduate work in venereal disease. That's his specialty. Regardless of what you hear from Steve Hodel about his dad being a surgeon, no, George Hodel had just enough surgical training, the minimum to graduate from medical school. And Steve will say, well, he has blah, 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 so many hours. Yeah, that's what everybody had. That's the minimum. That's all you needed. That's it. His specialty was venereal disease. That's what he did. And so he goes to work in New Mexico. He's a public health doctor in New Mexico. Public health in New Mexico in that time, when we're talking about the 1930s, involves tuberculosis, rabies, and of course, venereal disease. And so he's doing that. He comes back to Los Angeles and marries Dorothy number 2.